Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Software Development Podcast. Our guest today is Josh Sanabria, CEO of Go Architect. Josh is a visionary leader who uses design and technology to help transform the way communities plan and build their future. Josh, thanks for taking time to chat here.
Yeah, great. Thanks for having me.
Uh, the topic that we picked for today is, starting a startup. But before we get into the topic, if you don't mind giving a brief introduction about yourself and your company, that would be great.
Yeah. So again, I'm Josh Sanabria. I'm the CEO of Go Architect. So we are a design and technology company here in downtown Chicago. And you can think of us as a kind of quasi architecture firm or urban planning firm that uses software in a lot of ways to help out clients, communities, different types of stakeholders, investors, all that kind of stuff. So one example is that we work a lot with school districts who, of course, have a lot on their plate and need to gather a lot of data about their schools, a lot about the finances and money and kind of impact they're having in the community. And then, of course, what the community itself is thinking, wants to invest in, where their priorities are. So that can be anything from data analysis of where certain projects need to be or where they're going, all the way to surveys and kind of video and that community engagement style of project management. And we try to be very entrepreneurial in all of that. And we'll talk more about that also, but at least this kind of gives you an overview about what we do.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you. So let's jump right. We have like about a half hour to talk about this topic today. So let's jump right into the topic.
Yeah.
We the topic is broad enough, but it says starting a startup, and I think this is of interest to our audience in general. Uh, just as by way of background, I built software for many years before I launched the company to build our own products. Now, when I started this, I thought, okay, the challenges I was going to run into were going to be predominantly technical, and we
Hmm.
backed ourselves in able to being able to wade through those challenges. But as it turned out, sure, we continue to have our share of technical challenges, but that's not the part that intimidates us necessarily, because we're a group of engineers who've just done this a long time. We
Right.
realize that there's a number of other things, a whole lot of other things that we sometimes don't get the opportunity to learn while at work in a large mid-sized organization, that doesn't necessarily seamlessly port over as experience when you actually build or run your own company. Hope
Yeah.
that makes sense. But if having that as the context of the premise, if you could just walk us through to what were some of the challenges that you ran into, your journey of actually becoming an entrepreneur. What were some of the experiences that you had in the past that ported over seamlessly, and what were some things that you were sort of completely taken aback by or surprised by, and you had to find solutions on the go?
Yeah. Let's see, taken aback by, well, I would say one thing that always surprises me is that everything takes twice as long as you think it will. So if that's building something or getting a new client or, responding or having somebody respond to something that you need, inevitably it takes twice as long. So I guess be ready to have patience and whether that's just the mental patience or the kind of product patience where you don't just go out and build anything that comes to mind, but you actually wait and see what people are responding to and what they're willing to pay for. So definitely always surprised by the amount of patience that it requires. Um, I think too, I, 10, 15 years ago, when I was like in college and stuff, and I was thinking about startups and businesses, and I've always kind of been trying some idea of some type. I always thought that you needed to go out and raise venture capital and, have investors and be in Silicon Valley and all this kind of stuff. But the reality is that you really don't. You can build a business, software, or even another type of business, certainly, without those types of investors. You don't have to go and be a venture funded company to be successful or even to get off the ground. And for many years, I thought that that was the only route, but now I know that it's just one of many different routes. Um, I will say though, you do need investors of some type. So that can be maybe an old boss or an old friend that becomes a client who invests in you by giving you a project when you're very small and unproven. It could be a spouse or a partner who is willing to take on the household, chores or household costs while you don't earn any money or very much money. And so they're willing to support you or your family in the time it takes for you to get off the ground. And that way they are investing in you also. Of course, early employees, they might be investing in you from their time and the opportunity cost of not working for a more famous company or a different startup. In a way, they are also investing in you. So you need to still have investors, but they don't necessarily need to be venture capitalists or a bank or anything like that. That's another thing that really took a while to kind of figure out. And once you do realize it, though, it's actually pretty freeing in many ways.
You know, you brought up some brilliant points there. But brevity is not my forte, so I'm going to challenge myself to talk about a number of those things in the next 30 minutes. And if you get close enough to the time you have to go, Josh, just
Sure,
just let me know, and then we can pick this back up
no
another time
problem.
as well. A number of points, all of them as valid as the other. Let me touch upon some of them, and then we can talk a bit more. You started with patience. I was going to make notes, but the thing is, when I make notes, I lose eye contact, and it's always a challenge between do I make notes or do I just look at the speaker? I
All
want to
good.
remember some of what you just mentioned there. So you mentioned patience.
Yeah,
We need. You said things take twice as long. I was going to say things take 10 times as long, but I think twice is fair enough. But
yeah,
when you say patience, and this is very important because the reason I kicked this part off saying, hey, our expectations were technical challenges, but as many as we have those, we never get intimidated by those because each of us comes with a certain set of skill set to the table. And
yeah,
what you don't have is what's even more challenging than the ones that you do end up having. But patience, again, is less of a skill set and more of a trait, which
sure.
means, uh, does that mean to becoming an entrepreneur, you have to have a certain kind of mindset, which all of us may or may not have, or do you have to sort of, I don't know what the right choice of word is. How do you build that patience? Do you come prepared? I mean, no matter how much you come prepared, you're going to be surprised. So, what are some things you look out for? Like, what are if you have to make the word patience a bit more specific to the
Yeah.
problems we're talking about here, would those what might those be?
Well, I can just give you some very concrete examples. If you are, since this podcast is more technology focused, if you're going to go out and spend, even if you are a lean startup, aggressive type of person, and you come out with the MVP and it only has taken you 4 weeks or 6 weeks, and you've talked to customers and all this kind of stuff, you still need patience because at most, maybe you've talked to a few customers, people that are willing to respond to an email or people that you know. But it's going to take time for you to build up what I would consider any actual, statistically relevant data set of what customers want. It might take you twice as long as building the actual thing to get the feedback on what it is. Or let's say your startup is very kind of niche, B2B. You might launch it at a conference, and that conference might be 6 months away. And so, you're building and you're trying to find customers, but really that conference is going to be your first opportunity to have it in the hands of people. So you need to figure out what is a wise amount of time to build something in preparation for that, with the understanding that it might change after you do that conference or meeting or
Right.
whatever it is. Or if you're B2B, man, if you try to set up meetings with a large, institution or a large corporate client, you might be waiting weeks just to get on the phone with some acquisition person who may or may not even be the person to make the decision of whether to purchase your product. And that's let alone implementing it into their business process or their customer process. So I think you need to be prepared to wait and know what to do with that time. So you don't necessarily need to have all these skills from day one. I think that's unfair, but I guess just kind of have that in the back of your mind that it's not going to happen tomorrow. You're not going to launch it on Product Hunt or something and it's going to be like the big success. Even if you do get
Absolutely.
a lot of people off of Product Hunt, maybe 1% or less or something will actually sign up and use your product, let alone pay for it. So be ready to wait a long time for it to really gain momentum.
It's almost like you're reading my mind and walking our audience through my experience, which you have no clue about, but it's exactly the same. Whatever you're telling here, I think it's going to resonate with everybody else who's in this position as well. And I think sometimes you hear this, you digest it, but you have to live through the pain to actually appreciate it, right? I mean, that's just the
Yes.
nature of the beast.
I've lived through the pain a few times. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, all of us, right? And
Yeah.
I'm going to jump up on to a bunch of different things, and it might sound random, but it's just an interest of trying to talk about a number of different things in the window we
Yeah.
have.
Yeah. Go for it.
So in terms, you mentioned patience, right? You said you're reaching out B2B. One of the things we do is APIs, and we prospect B2B. And as a group of engineers who know how to build software, but not necessarily know how to, unfortunately, uh, sell it from a prospecting standpoint. It's something that was a skill we didn't have, then we didn't bring to the table, and we're
Mm,
trying to learn as we go. One of the things we realized was, just much like you mentioned, you posted somewhere on Product Hunt, maybe some people like it. That doesn't mean your life is going to dramatically change overnight.
right.
Even though a lot of the expectations, hey, I've solved world hunger, why would you not eat this up, right? You know what I mean? But that's just not
Right.
how it happens.
Right.
So prospecting, pitching, and sales, and how humbling that is. I want your 2 cents on uh, what does it mean to how do you go about it? Like, we use LinkedIn, Sales Navigator, etc. How do you go about it? What are some things that work, and what are
Yeah.
some things that you have to be prepared for, so you're not utterly disappointed? Like, sort
Yeah.
of uh, self motivation is part of this process, but I just get your thoughts on how you prospect, what it means, and where does motivation, if it does at all, come into play here.
Yes. Well, let's start with prospecting. I think that is extremely dependent on who your customers are. So, just as an example, if your application is for people buying homes, just to pick something random, right? Consumers buying homes. I mean, there are and small, relatively small number of ways that people do that, right? They go on Zillow, they realtor, any of those kind of marketplace types of things. Of course, there's technically still like print. You even can walk by a realtor's office and they have images in the
Mm.
window of homes for sale in that neighborhood. Of course, people Google things all the time. Banks who are doing loans. I mean, just like right there, I've listed 4 or 5 options where if you're searching for that customer, you need to be in that realtor's office. You need to take out an ad that somehow targets that Zillow group, or maybe you need to have relationships with banks who then reference people to your software. That audience is completely different than if your customer is a teenager who just wants to buy, a cool shirt, right? Like they're just in completely different places. They're a completely different language that you apply. Or like for us, where most of our clients are civic organizations like school districts or, towns. They aren't caring about Google ads, right? The way you talk to them is you go to conferences, you participate in group projects and then smaller group projects, and then you eventually get hired for an individual project, or you respond to what's called an RFP, a request for proposal, that the city government might put out. You respond to that. That's a completely different prospecting process than the previous two. So I think you need to understand who your customers are, or at least some idea of who they are, and then you need to analyze where they're hanging out. Because otherwise you're just kind of wasting your time, just shooting bullets into the air, and you're never going to hit the target, kind of thing. So maybe the better kind of answer to this is just try to figure out who your customer is as early as possible. And then once you have any sort of hint, just find out all of the physical or digital places where they hang out and make yourself relevant in those different places.
Great. So let's say, continuing what you just said there, two options, right? One is
Yeah.
you said pick the right approach, methodology, the platform. You know what I mean? It's Google Ads may not work in all cases. In some cases, you actually submit these requests for proposals, RFIs, RFPs, RFQs, whatever they're called. In
Yeah.
some other cases, you have to find your niche target audience to the extent you understand them, and try to see where they end up hanging out and what might be the best way to reach out to them. The second
Yeah.
facet of that I want to ask you, Josh, is how wide a nest do you need to cast? The reason I say this is when we started, people were
Yeah.
like, hey, you know what? You need to try these automated sales platforms. Why don't you sign up for some services there? So we sure tried them. You intend to send out like a 200, 500, 1,000 emails. You try to warm up your email
Yeah.
domains. You go through the pain process of doing that. Then you realize, out of the 100 emails that were sent out, or 500 emails that day, 90% of them never hit those inboxes. And with Google and my Azure, tightening things there, a lot of
Right.
these sales products don't actually provide the value that they claim to provide.
Right.
So that's one aspect of it. So casting a wide net versus what we are trying to do right now, which is spending half an hour to an hour, if not more, to find that one prospect on LinkedIn and trying to draft a message that's very context sensitive to what it is that they actually do. So this is, both ends of the spectrum. We start out saying, hey, let me send it to everybody that has a first name Josh. Now
Yeah.
we're trying to say, you know what, let's go exactly find out what Josh does, what Josh did, what Josh's company is doing. Is it relevant? Does it make sense in the context of what we're selling?
Right.
If these are two extremes, is there a right answer here? Like, what would your recommendation be?
Yeah, I think the right answer in general is to be specific. So if those are two extremes, I would maybe more error on the side of being more specific. And I think part of that is just my maybe, I've grown up with the internet. I mean, I have received hundreds of random LinkedIn and other messages and emails and Instagram ads over my lifetime. I mean, hundreds, thousands maybe, right? And I will say most are pretty pathetic. They're so generic, so useless, so just unthoughtful that I just can't imagine who is responding to those in a way that generates income. It's just like it's almost inconceivable to me who that winning is winning over. And so I would say rather than spending 10 minutes on a Google ad or something that speaks to nobody, spend the 10 minutes on an ad that speaks to like 5 people, something. Because at least you'll get those 5 people, then you get 5 people more and 5 people more after that. And I think when you actually think of a lot of really great products, the really, really good ones are in many ways marketed by their users or their customers. I mean, you can apply this to anything. I mean, Facebook, when it started on the campus of Harvard, had no marketing budget. I mean, it was literally just a social network, and it spread socially. But it can also apply to other things. I mean, the first, people on Airbnbs talk to other people who are renting out space. Stripe, the first people that were using payments and all of that, the first people that used Survey Monkey, when you saw the little Survey Monkey logo at the end of something, it had a natural reoccurring kind of marketing from the use of the product. So that's the type of stuff where it's worth spending more time on making your product sticky, like, being used more often by a certain customer, and then making it more useful to that customer. Otherwise, like, really, what's the point? You're just going to spend money. I mean, you're going to waste
Totally right.
hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars, maybe.
I couldn't agree more. Just to add to
Yeah.
what you said, when we use these sales platforms, they try to give you the impression that, hey, you know what, we have these beautiful variable substitutions. So you can customize this email reach out that goes to Josh. So Josh actually tends, and not Josh, I'm just taking it as an example,
Yeah.
believes that Krish actually handpicked me to have sent this email out. But it's not true at all. People know it because it
Yeah.
you can put that in the subject, put that in the body, so it constructs it. It doesn't look as terrible as it was a blast send out, essentially, right? But at the same time, I just want to call out for the fact that just because it substitute, supports this level of sometimes smarter levels of variable substitutions on the actual email template that you have on these
Yeah.
platforms, it does not in any form, way, or shape mean that Josh is going to believe that Krish actually did all the due diligence, which is why reaching
Yeah.
out very specifically by doing the research makes sense. But the reason I even popped that question was there's like 4 million people in the industry, right? I think, give or take, in the US, if I did the research correctly most recently. And I was doing the math. If we reached out to like 15, 20 people a day, how long is it going to take us to get to 4 million people? So there is a problem with scale. Well, how do we deal with scale if we're going to do these specific reach outs?
Yeah. Well, I think it kind of depends on what scale your product is going to operate at. I mean, okay, there's, 4 million people who work in software in the United States. Okay, great. But when you really break it down, the number is much smaller. I mean, let's just say I'm just going off of, you know, my own imagination for a second, right? So let's say there's 4 million people. Well, at least 20% of them are probably in some sort of project management and they don't actually even write software. So are they your customers? Or are you a project management something, or are you geared towards the actual developer? Okay, so then let's say that 800,000 are out the door. Now you're at 3.2. Okay, you know, are they all actually active working in the software development industry right now? Like they have jobs? Maybe. I bet you like at least 10% of them don't. So that's another 300,000 at door. So now you're down to like 2.8. Okay, so then what? Now we at least have the basic categories of front end and back end developers. I mean, if you're creating a back end product, unless you have some full stack guy who is like more on the, does things on like Upwork or Fiverr, most big companies are very, very stratified. I mean, if you're front end or you're back end, you don't necessarily work on the same thing
Right.
unless you're a very, very small team. So let's assume that half are front end and half are back. So now we're down to like 1.3, right? Let's say back end developers. Now, even within that, I mean, you have people that work in like embedded systems. You have people that more like on the mechanical engineering. You have web. You have this whole like quasi quick crypto group. I mean, like, what are you going to do? Maybe half of them are actually useful. So now you're down to like 600,000, 500,000 people. Maybe that is your actual customer group. And then even out of them, right? Who is actually in charge of purchasing or really buying new software? Who is your actual customer? Maybe 20%, 30% of those people actually have any decision making power in the organization that they operate in. So now you're down to maybe 150,000, give or take. So we've taken that like really big kind of sexy number of 4 million people, which sounds good on an economic report. But when you actually get down to the who your customer is, it's probably only a couple thousand, and then that's assuming that it's like
So Josh,
everything goes
I'm going to
well,
interrupt you there, right? Okay, that's a good start there. I'm going to interrupt you there to
Yeah,
ask you this, which is, so the first point here, the takeaway is, even though there's a lot, at first glance, it's going to be a lot of people, you have to reach out a lot. If what you're saying is, if you do your due diligence, you're going to narrow down that number to a meaningfully small number, meaning you
yeah,
have to go through those filters. So you're not, again, even, you're not trying to cast a wide net across 4 million people. You have to get to the 150,000 people. Now, how easy or difficult it is to get to that number, I think you could talk for an hour, just about how to get to that
yeah,
point. But even if you took the 150,000 people, right, Josh? And if you do 10 people a day, you're talking 3,000, give or take a year. You're talking about 50 years to get to that point if it's one
sure,
salesperson doing it. So
sure,
even that number is a big number. So what, like, if somebody needs to spend 2 months, 3 months doing this and has to make the most impact, are there like one or two things that you could recommend that says, you know what, this works better than something else?
yeah. Well, I think we are fortunate to have a couple of things in our advantage now. So LinkedIn is obviously a great tool. You can do all kinds of searching and filtering based off of like job titles. So there's that kind of more, let's say, all technical route. I would say that one good route actually might be different types of conferences. So, and I don't necessarily mean just the like South by Southwest or any of the like, big kind of fancy ones. I mean, very hyper specific conferences geared towards a specific type of professional. For example, we use MongoDB or Mongo Atlas for our Engage app. There are many other database options, obviously. Um, but Mongo puts out an annual conference for developers who
In New
use
York City,
their
right?
product. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many people attend that conference. I've never been to it, but if you really have a specific product that is useful in that case to, backend developers who work with large data sets and yada yada, go to that conference. I mean, that's probably where you'll meet some of them. Have a booth. Uh, you know, have something enticing to talk to them about. Get emails. Some of them have sponsorship packages where you can get your video or your demo or something in front of a lot of people at one time. I mean, there are ways to do it. It's not necessarily free, but you could do it, right? You just have to find the equivalent of that for whatever it is that you're making.
Correct. So I think you mentioned being specific, use the filters, reach out to a much smaller number of people, try to go to these conferences, and
Yeah.
it's a mixed bag and see what makes sense, what makes the most sense. And I think those points are perfectly valid. I just want to sort of warn, if that's the right word, the audience here is, it's sometimes easier said than done, and you have to again
Oh
digest this
yeah.
pain because we've all done it
Yeah.
and tried it, and this sometimes it's almost like playing. I play poker, and uh, if you wait for the best hands, sometimes you could be in a session where you never get a good hand and you can never play a hand at all.
Yeah.
And you end up winning a big hand with like a deuce and a seven offsuit or something, which means, things just were meant to happen. But so I try to relate this sometimes to poker because it's no matter how many rules you follow, there is
Yeah.
this element of subjectivity and there's a broad window of subjectivity that each of us is going to go through. And
Yeah.
you learn to appreciate that as you've done this long enough. uh, I think I just want to say that. But let me ask you.
Yeah.
You mentioned, just switching gears quickly. You mentioned support system. You
Sure.
mentioned partners, and each of us have our own. It resonated directly with me because when I quit what I was doing full time, Josh, to build this company, uh, you know, it, my wife actually does everything you mentioned about the household and being able to pay the bills. She literally plays that role. Now, sometimes some of us are blessed, knock on wood, that we have that support system,
Yeah.
but not everybody may have that support system. What does it mean And since both of us live in the US, even though the audience for the podcast is in Europe as well in other parts of the world, but just try to keep your region in mind. If you're in the US with with what's available to us, there's a fair number of challenges, right? So what if you don't have that support system?
Yeah.
Does it mean you know what, this is not a good idea, or is it still possible?
Yeah. You know, this is actually a good kind of closing topic because the community that you surround yourself with is part of your success or failure in many ways. And I would say the number one kind of piece of advice is that you need to have different people or different groups for different purposes. So if you do have a spouse or a partner, they may not know anything about business or startups or technology or whatever, right? And so they are there to support you in one specific way or in many specific ways, but a certain selection of them. And so it's unfair to put the pressure on them to understand everything you're going through. So I suggest having different groups, right? Maybe there's one that's more about startups and business, and they can be your group to complain to or seek advice from or get support from. And then you have, your personal side, your friends, your spouse, who more provide the emotional support and maybe some case, maybe the financial or let's say home support. And then, maybe you have people you just exercise with. And so you have the kind of mental and physical health aspect. I attend a church here in Chicago. So there's that kind of spiritual and community support system from the church element. So maybe that's a part of it. I suggest really spending maybe not exactly the same amount of time, right? But I suggest spending a lot of time also developing the people around you and what aspects they support you in. And nobody's going to fit every single one, right? It's unfair for your startup group to also support your home
Right.
needs, and your church group is probably not going to support your startup needs, and your spouse is probably not going to understand your your startup needs. So everyone has this like different role to play, but it's pretty important to find them. And so I suggest looking on apps like Eventbrite or Meetup or even those silly conferences I keep bringing up. Like you'll meet people who are in similar phases as you are. There's basically every city has some sort of meetup club, community, multiple clubs. Take a chance, go out, sit there. Even if you don't meet anyone the first couple times, I think you'd be surprised. The more your face gets recognized, the more you recognize other people, feel comfortable, you'll start to form those
Yeah, I know
relationships
what you're saying
slowly.
makes a ton of sense, right? In other words, to loosely quote a reference from Seinfeld, I'm not sure if you watch the show, but
Yeah,
it's almost like keeping the world separate, as George says it, right? You need to keep those worlds separate for
a
sanity to prevail
little bit. Yeah,
of some sort. Uh, do you? I have a couple more things to ask you. Do you have
yeah,
like 5 minutes, or are we?
yeah, yeah. 5 minutes.
Okay. So, there is a lot more to chat here. So I'm going to invite you to for another podcast. Josh, if you want to come, you're more than welcome. Just hit me up because there's a lot more we can talk about here. Because, everything that you talked, there's a lot more detail that I would, be what would like to get into, if we have the time at some point.
Sure.
But let me, so as we get to the close here, one of the things that resonates with me repeatedly as somebody who's been wanting to be an entrepreneur right after or even before I graduated, but while I was in college, like I think 100 years ago, I was still wanting to do this. But sometimes you are on a boat, you sail, but you might be on the wrong boat, so you keep sailing. And the unfortunate thing about education, it's a
Mm,
strange thing to say, but I'm going to say it regardless. I was in college for like 8 long years. In
mhm.
hindsight, would I have done that? Probably not. Education gives you the sense of security, and it does, right? It's a good thing to have these qualifications and diplomas and whatnot. And I would be hypocritical if I said no, because I was in college for a long time. But the problem is, it gives you this, puts you in a comfort zone where you have a job, you get paid, it's decent enough. So you almost don't, I know a lot of people who don't even have the motivation to try something else, because not because they're not skillful or talented or risk averse. It's because, hey, you know what? I work for this big company, I'm getting paid. Why do I have to go through this pain of doing something different? So
Yeah.
all of what we've spoken of here thus far is fun, but I don't know if it's necessarily easy, right? It's painful, and I mean, we didn't make it sound a lot painful. It is actually incredibly painful sometimes. So
Yeah.
if somebody's watching this or listening to our podcast and like, hey, why should I even become an entrepreneur? You know what I mean? Is it like, if I have a job, I'm working for a big company, it pays well, is there something I'm missing out on? I mean, other than personality and traits and personal
Yeah.
preferences, let's say I'm going to make it difficult for you. Let's say it's not personal preferences being the answer. Are there some good
Right.
reasons that you can share with us where you're like, you know what, you should actually seriously consider entrepreneurship because you're missing out on these five things?
Um, in general, I don't believe that everyone is or should be entrepreneurial. I I think it's fine for most people if you have a job and you do well in your job and you add value to your coworkers and company and communities that you work with. I think that is admirable and valuable in its own sense. So I would personally say that unless you see a specific problem that is worth spending your time on, and I don't mean just like a couple hours a day, I mean like, you know, the next 5 to 10 years, if you don't have that problem that you see, or you don't have the drive to resolve that problem, then just stay where you are and do as good of a job as you can where you are. Because you don't really start a business to save time. You're going to end up spending more time, like on a per hour basis or per day basis. You don't necessarily start a business to make lots of money. I think that's a huge misconception from the startup world, is that you'll become a millionaire or billionaire or something. That's really not true on average. Most small business owners are just regular people,
Right.
right? Um, I do think, though, that for me, it was exciting and I had always dreamed about doing it and I was ready for it and was always looking for the opportunity to do it. But that's definitely not going to be everyone's situation. So it's not going to be easy, but it's going to be, at the very least, interesting.
More than interesting. No, totally. Could
but
couldn't
uh, but
agree
yeah,
more there.
I think that's like a real YouTube type of thing where it's like, why are you working for somebody else? Yada yada yada. I think that devalues work. And I think that devalues a lot of just the hard work and honest work that a lot of people do. And as somebody who has started a business, I need employees, I need team members who are dedicated to their job and who are, going to do the best that they can in the scenario that they can. So I think it's fine. If you don't want to start your own thing, you're not ready, your career is very long. I mean, I'm 34. Conceivably, my career has 30 years left in it, right? And that's assuming I retire at 65. I mean, I could easily have two or three or more different careers after this. So I think don't be in a rush necessarily.
You articulated that beautifully, Josh, and your composure, you're so calm. So all of this, I think, at least resonates very, very well with me, and I'm
Hmm,
pretty sure it's going to do the same with our audience as well. Awesome. I think
appreciate
we've
it.
got to the point where you need to go to your next meeting. So any closing comments before we call it wraps?
No, I don't think so, but it's a pleasure talking with you. I hope people are encouraged to take a risk on something. Maybe it's not starting your own business, but take a risk on adding value somewhere.
No, very well said, right? I'll just end with one of the quotes that I'm going to paraphrase. I saw the other day. It says, you got one life, live it bold with audacity, dare to fail and try. And again,
Yeah.
there's no right or wrong answer. If those quotes resonate with you, then, you want to be in the business of whatever it is that we discussed here.
Yeah.
Awesome. I'll include, George, any links that you want for me to include in the podcast, let me know and I'll include it. So
Appreciate it.
folks, we talked to Josh of Go Architect. I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I'm going to include links to Josh's company and his LinkedIn profile. So please feel free to reach out to him uh, for anything that you are doing that's relevant to what Josh is doing as well. Awesome. Thanks a lot, Josh. Much
Thank
appreciated.
you. Thanks, Krish. I appreciate it too.